Pesto mirrored Karoline's organized nature. Political files were always neatly arranged on her home office desk, and her courtroom attire was laid out every evening in advance. But this morning, Karoline wasn't heading to the White House, where she normally commanded attention as President Donald Trump's spokesperson. Instead, she had to attend to a small personal issue at the Pesto Municipal Court, a contractual misunderstanding involving her family's used truck business, which she felt had been misinterpreted. Rather than her usual formal attire, Karoline chose a more relaxed yet still polished look, a navy blue blazer paired with a crisp white blouse and black slacks. In front of her bathroom mirror, she secured her blonde hair into a neat ponytail, the same hair she had always taken pride in. At 27, her face carried the firmness built from years of working in close quarters with Trump and independently studying law through campaign materials. "This will be quick," she reminded herself while grabbing a banana and a travel mug of fresh coffee. Her BMW, a gift to herself after helping Trump secure a major election win, waited in the garage. She loved the car, though she occasionally caught startled glances from people surprised to see someone her age emerge from such a luxury vehicle. The morning traffic in Pesto crept along slowly, but Karoline wasn't concerned. She had allowed herself plenty of time. Tuning into NPR, she mentally went over her case documents. The dispute stemmed from a truck maintenance contract between her family's business and a local service provider. The terms on paper conflicted with the charges listed on the invoice. She had taken photos of every relevant document to build a solid case. Out of the blue, her car's Bluetooth signaled an incoming call. The dashboard displayed the name, Michael Reynolds, a senior advisor at the White House. Her heart skipped a beat. Calls from him were rarely casual. "Karoline, sorry for the early call." Michael's voice rang through the speakers. "We've got a problem with the President's Gulf of America decree. The media's in a frenzy. I need your response urgently." Karoline's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The Gulf of America initiative, Trump's controversial renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, was one of the more sensitive topics she handled for the administration. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "Before noon. I'm sending the documents now. Review and call me as soon as you can," he replied. "Understood," Karoline said calmly, though her brain was already strategizing. She'd intended to arrive early at the courthouse to navigate the building, but priorities had just shifted. Spotting a coffee shop nearby, she parked, opened her laptop, connected it to her phone's hotspot, and began reading the documents Michael had forwarded. The media inquiries were intense, requiring well-structured, legally sound responses. She took detailed notes, focused on crafting the perfect reply. Time passed quickly. When she checked the clock, she was startled. It was nearly time for court, and the courthouse was still 10 minutes away. She made a quick call to Michael to share her initial input and promised to provide a comprehensive follow-up after her court appearance. Back in traffic, Karoline stayed composed. She prided herself on punctuality and had never been late to a press event. But she also understood that her responsibilities as White House press secretary weren't ones she could brush aside. The Gulf of America response would influence national perception, and that morning's message was crucial. She pulled into the Pesto Municipal Court parking lot just minutes past the scheduled start. As she briskly made her way to the building, her phone buzzed. A message from Michael read, "Thanks for the fast response. Nailed it. Appreciate you." Putting this first, Karoline allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. At least her delay hadn't been for nothing. However, she had no idea that those few late minutes were about to spark events that would challenge deep-rooted prejudices in a system she never thought she'd have to confront. Judge Edward Grayson's courtroom was waiting, and this morning was about to take a dramatic turn. Grayson's courtroom was notorious for its strict order and frosty efficiency. At 62, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, He projected the gravitas of someone who'd spent 3 decades on the bench. His black robe was always immaculate, and he sat perched above the room like a watchful sentinel as people entered. More than 20 individuals were already seated, mostly for minor infractions like traffic violations or small contract disputes. Grayson surveyed the crowd approvingly. Most were dressed respectfully, and he appreciated their timeliness. "All rise," the bailiff Robert Hayes announced as the session began. Grayson opened proceedings with practiced routine, dispatching the first few cases efficiently. To him, tardiness symbolized disregard for the law. A few minutes into the session, the courtroom doors opened. Karoline entered quietly, attempting not to disturb the proceedings, but Grayson froze mid-sentence, his gaze snapping toward her, eyes narrowing. "Step forward!" he barked, voice cold and commanding. The current case was paused as all eyes turned to Karoline. She walked to the podium, standing with poise despite the tension. Grayson checked his docket. "You're Karoline Leavitt, scheduled at the start of this session," he said, drawing out the words. "Do you believe your time is more important than this court's, Ms. Leavitt?" Before she could speak, Grayson continued, raising his voice to draw attention. He intended to make her an example. The room shifted. Earlier, a middle-aged businessman had been late and barely received a notice, but Grayson's tone now was sharp. "This is not a press briefing or a media circus where you arrive at your leisure. This is a courtroom," he scolded, not even looking at her documents. Karoline noted his dismissive demeanor. He regarded her as a young, unimportant figure. The bailiff, Robert Hayes, watched with growing discomfort. He'd seen this pattern before. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Karoline began. "You may not," Grayson interrupted firmly. "I've heard every excuse. Traffic, emergencies, it's all the same. The court starts on time." He lifted his gavel, reinforcing his authority as the gallery sat in silence. A young woman who'd entered just before Karoline sat still. Her own tardiness had gone unnoticed. A disparity was emerging, visible to most in the room except the judge himself. "This court does not tolerate disregard for its rules," Grayson said, face slightly flushed. "Perhaps a fine will help you understand the seriousness of punctuality." Karoline remained composed. She dealt with condescending reporters and political adversaries, dismissing her role. But this felt different. A clear abuse of authority, on public display in a system she once respected. The tension was thick. Even the court clerk, Mrs. Margaret Evans, who had worked with Grayson for over a decade, was uneasy as she typed the record. Just last week, a seasoned male lawyer had arrived 20 minutes late and was gently warned. The inconsistency was becoming blatant. Grayson leaned forward, ready to deliver judgment. The sunlight from tall windows cast shadows over his stern features. "Miss Leavitt," he announced, voice booming, "you are hereby fined $500 for contempt of court." Karoline didn't flinch. She mentally recorded every word, every gesture. Grayson had yet to look her in the eye. The arrogance in his tone reminded her of countless political encounters where her youth and position were underestimated. Clerk Evans hesitated before entering the fine into the system. She scribbled a side note for her personal records. "This didn't sit right," Grayson continued, emboldened by Karoline's silence. "Let this be a reminder. Order and respect are the backbone of justice. Without them, chaos reigns." Some attendees exchanged glances. The woman in the suit, who'd arrived late, looked down, remembering her own escape from scrutiny. An older man shook his head knowingly. Bailiff Hayes kept his posture firm, but clenched his jaw. Karoline inhaled slowly. She had handled tougher crises, but this struck a personal chord. Quietly she took out her phone, noting every detail of the fine and exchange. "You'll pay this fine today," Grayson added with a smirk. "We wouldn't want you late for that too, would we?" A few nervous chuckles broke the silence, but quickly faded. The morning sun now illuminated Karoline's face. Her posture remained professional, but her eyes revealed a steeliness that few had dared confront. Years of study and political navigation had prepared her for this. "Do you understand the fine as I've explained it?" Grayson asked, expecting compliance. Karoline's reply was calm and precise. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely." She'd learned that sometimes the best strategy was to observe, record, and wait for the right moment. Grayson, feeling satisfied, moved on without realizing the extent to which he'd exposed his bias. He didn't notice her quietly documenting everything, nor did he see her typing a brief message to her White House team. I knew that speaking further would only reinforce the very bias I was addressing. Instead, I saw this moment as an opportunity to open a wider dialogue about fairness within the judicial system. The other defendants looked on in stunned silence, many gripping their phones despite the courtroom's strict no-recording policy. It was a moment they'd later tell their children about, the day a young woman stood up and boldly confronted the prejudice they had long sensed, but never dared, to challenge. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, typed faster than she ever had, determined to record every word of this unprecedented moment. She had seen Judge Grayson reprimand countless defendants over the years, but never before had someone confronted him with such precision and poise. Sunlight poured through the courtroom windows, casting the space in a glow like a spotlight on a stage. Grayson remained seated, his authority visibly weakening as Karoline stood firm at the podium. In that instant, she evolved from a defendant into a symbol of sharp intellect and unwavering courage. Her next words would go beyond a simple court hearing. They would set the stage for a broader reckoning. What began as a minor civil dispute had transformed into something far greater, a powerful display of strength that none could overlook. Karoline's defiance sent shockwaves through the courtroom like an unfolding earthquake in slow motion. Judge Grayson's reaction was immediate and awkward. He shuffled papers, cleared his throat multiple times, and adjusted his glasses, each gesture betraying his rising discomfort. "Ms. Leavitt," Grayson said, his voice noticeably softer, "please allow me to be the first to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." He pressed a button to call his clerk. "We'll remove this fine from the record immediately." Karoline remained composed at the podium, her posture poised and professional. "Your Honor," she responded calmly, "I must respectfully decline. The dismissal of the fine." Gasps and murmurs echoed throughout the room. "Instead," Karoline continued, "I'd like to speak to the broader issue." The other defendants leaned forward, fully engrossed. Mrs. Evans stopped typing altogether, her fingers hovering above the keys. Robert Hayes, the bailiff, edged closer to the center aisle, sensing the historical weight of the moment. "This morning," Karoline explained, unlocking her phone to read her notes, "I watched 7 people enter the courtroom after proceedings had begun. 3 were older professionals who received no criticism or reprimand, 2 were young students who received verbal warnings, and 2, myself included, were met with the harshest response. The difference in treatment, I believe, stems from our age or public profile." Judge Grayson's face reddened, not from anger, but from shame. "Ms. Leavitt, these are very serious claims," he said, his voice unsteady. "This courtroom treats every individual equally." "With respect, Your Honor, the evidence says otherwise," Karoline replied evenly. She then turned slightly, to address everyone present. "I've already sent a report on this incident to my team at the White House. As a member of the administration, I have an obligation to point out biased conduct within our judicial systems." At the back of the room, a young law student scribbled furiously into her notebook. This was the kind of courtroom reality that no casebook could teach. An elderly local observer wiped away a tear, reminded of injustices he had faced in his own lifetime. "What exactly are you proposing?" Grayson asked, now visibly uneasy. The sunlight streaming in through the windows seemed to spotlight his discomfort. Karoline placed both hands firmly on the podium and replied with clarity and intent. "I propose 3 actions. First, I will pay the $500 fine, not because it is just, but to ensure today's events are formally documented." She raised 2 fingers. "Second, I request a full review of the contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom over the past 6 months to examine trends in how defendants are treated. And third, I suggest mandatory bias training for all court staff, including judges." The room remained silent, but the air felt electric with tension. Mrs. Evans resumed typing, more focused than ever. Robert Hayes gave a subtle nod. He'd seen many cases mishandled without anyone daring to speak out. Grayson tried to regain composure. "While your proposals are thoughtful, they seem disproportionate for what was simply a case of tardiness." "With due respect, Your Honor," Karoline replied, "what's excessive is the continued pattern of biased decisions in our courtrooms. My work with President Trump has shown me how small injustices add up, creating major barriers to fair treatment." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a check. "I'll pay the fine now," she said, "and my team will follow up regarding the court's records." There was no anger in her voice, only the firm tone of someone using the system to expose its flaws. The morning sun filled every corner of the room as Grayson sat back in his chair, diminished. The power balance had shifted. This wasn't just Karoline's personal victory, it was a powerful affirmation of her capability. By that afternoon, word of what happened in Judge Grayson's courtroom was spreading rapidly through New Hampshire's legal and political circles. It began with a single text from the law student. "Just saw the White House press secretary challenge a judge. Unreal." Another text followed. "Karoline Leavitt just owned a courtroom in Plato. You won't believe what happened." Back at her office, Karoline was reviewing documents related to the Gulf of America decree when her phone started buzzing nonstop. Colleagues from New Hampshire called, many eager to share their own uncomfortable encounters with Judge Grayson, stories they'd never told for fear of backlash. "This isn't about me," Karoline told David Parker, a campaign advisor for Trump, who had stopped by her office. "If someone like me gets treated like that, imagine what regular people go through every day." She showed him a growing list of messages from reporters and public officials. Meanwhile, in the break room at the courthouse, Mrs. Evans revealed a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk. "I started writing things down years ago," she admitted to her colleagues. "Every time something seemed off, names, dates, fines, I recorded it. By early evening, local news stations had picked up the story. Channel 7's Jonathan Lee stood outside the courthouse. The White House press secretary was fined $500 for being late this morning, he reported. But what followed has ignited a broader conversation about courtroom bias. Social media soon exploded with hashtags like Judge Grayson and Legal Genius trending across New Hampshire. Dozens of people began sharing their own stories involving the same judge. A clear pattern of unfair treatment toward younger or less established defendants emerged. That evening, Judge Grayson sat at home watching the news in growing anxiety. His phone had been ringing all afternoon, calls from colleagues, the state judicial board, and curious reporters. After 30 years on the bench, his career was now under intense scrutiny. Karoline's office phone rang again. This time it was Emily Carter, a well-known journalist in New Hampshire. "We've been trying to expose this kind of bias for about years," Emily said. "But coming from someone in your position, someone who lived it firsthand, this changes everything. Will you speak at a press conference tomorrow?" At the Plato courthouse, clerks had already begun pulling Grayson's past case files. Whispers filled the filing office as staff noticed undeniable patterns in his decisions. One clerk found that younger defendants had been given maximum fines nearly 3 times more often than older ones for identical infractions. By nightfall, the story had reached national headlines. Judge faces scrutiny. After fining White House press secretary, read one, unexpected legal star emerges in courtroom, proclaimed another. Online discussions erupted over age-based discrimination in courtrooms, with Karoline's experience becoming the central example. That night, Robert Hayes received numerous calls. "We've all seen this before," he said, "but this time someone with real power saw it and did something." Late that night, Karoline sat in her home office reading hundreds of messages she'd received. Advocacy groups invited her to speak, media outlets wanted her insight, law schools extended invitations to guest lecture on justice and reform. She opened her laptop and began drafting a formal report for the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. This was no longer just about one judge. It had grown into something much larger, a call for systemic change. Her phone buzzed again. A message from the law student read, "Thank you for proving we can challenge the system. You gave us hope." 1 week later, the Judicial Conduct Committee opened a formal investigation into Judge Edward Grayson. The top-floor conference room in the State Justice Building buzzed as investigators reviewed thousands of court cases from the past 5 years. Laura Bennett, a seasoned investigator, spread folders across a long table. "Look at these numbers," she said, showing her team a spreadsheet. "Defendants under 30 were fined an average of $400. Older defendants just $120 for the same infractions." Nearby, Mrs. Evans sat in a small room, her notebook in hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I noticed the pattern in my first year," she said. "The way he talked to people, it changed based on how old they were or what they did for work." The investigation had just begun, but already the truth was becoming undeniable. Beyond fines, the team interviewed dozens of former defendants, lawyers, and court staff. Robert Hayes, the BFF, provided a handwritten statement detailing hundreds of incidents he'd seen over 15 years. "Some days, I counted how often the judge interrupted younger defendants compared to older ones," he wrote. "The difference was massive. Young defendants were interrupted 5 times more on average." At the White House, Karoline continued her media duties for Trump, but her office became a gathering place for those wanting to share stories. Young advisors brought in personal accounts, while community activists shared documents on long-ignored complaints. "We need to organize this," Karoline told her assistant, eyeing the growing pile. "Every story matters. Every incident counts. This isn't just about one judge, it's about how we view justice." The investigation uncovered deeper patterns. Young women got the highest fines. Cases with defendants under 35 were processed 40% faster. Payment plan requests from younger individuals were denied 3 times more. Witnesses supporting young defendants were interrupted more often. Grayson was questioned multiple times. Confronted with the data, he appeared genuinely surprised, having never realized the extent of his bias. "I thought I was fair," he said softly. For the first time, he seemed to understand the impact of his actions. Other judges in the region also showed similar bias. What began as an investigation into one judge revealed a much larger problem. By the 3rd week, Laura Bennett and her team released a 300-page report filled with stats and testimonies. "This doesn't just show isolated incidents," she said. "It reveals a quiet but deep pattern of bias." As the inquiry neared its end, one truth became clear. Karoline's experience had opened a sealed door. Behind it were years of buried discrimination. The issue now was not just Grayson's fate, but fixing a system that allowed such bias to grow unchecked. 3 months after Karoline's courtroom moment, change began. Sunlight beamed onto a new sign. Center for Judicial Training and Fairness. Grayson was gone. He chose resignation over a public hearing, but in a twist, he joined the solution. "I never saw my own bias," he admitted at a training for judges. "I thought fairness was treating everyone the same, but I never examined how my background influenced my decisions." Karoline watched from the back of the room. She hadn't expected this outcome. Beside her sat Mrs. Margaret Evans, now head of a court monitoring program. Reforms spread. New rules demanded detailed records and independent monthly reviews. Robert Hayes led training for court staff. "We are the courtroom's eyes and ears," he told trainees. "Silence is no longer an option." Back at the White House, Karoline framed her $500 fine receipt. It symbolized change. Below it hung a photo with law students she now taught in a weekly ethics class. A new reporting system logged over 200 bias incidents in its first month. "It's not just about punishment," Karoline told a reporter. "It's about changing how we think about justice. Everyone deserves respect." Reforms reached other cities. Courts began bias training, fairness audits, and community oversight. Law schools added diversity education. One day, Karoline received a letter from a student who had witnessed her courtroom stand. It read, "You showed me change is possible." The student had launched a legal clinic for those facing discrimination. The elderly man from that day returned, noticing multilingual signs, a help desk, and equal treatment by security. "I've been coming here 40 years, he told a clerk tearfully. "This is the first time it feels fair." Karoline's phone buzzed. The Judicial Board wanted her to lead a reform commission. As she read the message, she remembered that morning in court. Her stand had sparked change, now spreading far beyond. A new plaque in the courthouse read, "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat people." Below it was the date Karoline entered Grayson's courtroom and changed everything.